Hey everyone, Emmerron here. So this week I wanted to talk to you about a subject that I think neatly follows the discussion we had last week around planning session 0 and having those more difficult and maybe weighty discussions with your players about those things that you want to cover, the things that maybe we aren't going to cover because we're being sensitive to their needs and their sensibilities, and then those things that we are going to keep at arm's length. And I think one of those discussions and one of those topics that we will regularly talk about when we are considering that is character death in the game. Now, those of you who are GMs coming from another system like Dungeons and Dragons is, I'm under no disillusion, probably the most popular and common system that you'll all be coming from. But if you happen to find your way here through a smaller system that maybe is less well known, but deals with character death in more light-handed ways. For example, one of the systems I know I use plenty is the Morkborg system, or some of you may know it through Cyborg, but the bones of it are about the same. A character, when they hit 0 health, they break, you roll a dice, and you determine what kind of straits they're in terms of like, are they in a bad place? Are they in a place where they can come back from it? Are they in a place where, you know, they are going to die in 3 rounds, or are they just dead outright, you know? But there's some ambiguousness to it. And in D&D, I know you're given a lot of chances to survive death, right? There's a lot of opportunity to not have that final moment in a given part of the game, right? And I have done a video on comparing D&D's death system specifically to Cyberpunk's. I will link that above here so that you can all check that out, because I do think that that is a valuable resource for the type of discussion that we as Cyberpunk GMs are going to have with our players around what death means in this world. So let's start first by talking about life path. So when we talk about a player first coming into the world, we know them through their life path. So when we as players build a character, we look at this person's history by way of rolling dice on a table. Now, there will be another discussion that I want to have around this probably next week, talking about some of the ways that this can be maybe abused, and not so much as it's written in the book, but in the way that some players and GMs may allow for that life path to be customized, and the heavy kind of latitude that that can take towards maybe making someone too noteworthy for the type of person a rank 4 rep 0 character would be. But I'm not going to talk too deeply about that this week, just because I think that that has enough meat on its bones to have its own discussion. So for now, let's talk about life path in the context of death, because I think to know who a character is, we first have to know how they lived, right? And so the early part of a character begins with the people they know, where they grew up, and the sort of things that they are fighting for. So most edge runners in most games, I think, are going to be some kind of street rat, or at the very least, they blend in with that background. So even your solos are going to be, you know, gang enforcers, corporate enforcers, someone that doesn't have a whole lot to their own name, even if they are powerful by some measure. They've got guns, they've got fighting skills, whatever. They're still broke. At the end of the month, they still need to make rent. And I think any role is very easy to account for this, right? With one minor exception, and yes, I do say it's a minor exception, but that being the exec. So execs are the only special case that I'll kind of talk about in this video, because they have their housing provided for them, and because they have less expenses immediately resulting from that. They have a better starting point where their needs are concerned than the rest of the party. it might be hard to think in the context of like a regular edge runner group how a exec could have desperation, right? Like the other kind of roles do. And I think the best way to picture this is that in corporate Night City, there is literally bloodshed that happens when a person moves from Corporation A to Corporation B, or, you know, if the wrong person gets into a corporation, the other corporations that have an active interest in that person's ideas or management or whatever, if they have an issue with those kind of philosophies and such being applied to that new corporation, this oppositional corporation is going to try and take that person out. So there are, you know, through blackmail and things, ways that that corporate executive might be just as desperate as any other edge runner at rank 4. Because remember, execs at rank 4 aren't Saburo Arasaka. They're not General Lundy. They're not these giant figureheads that we read about in the corporate section of the core rulebook. They are middle management at best. They have a couple of people that answer to them, maybe. I believe they have one person backing them up in their teamwork skill at that rank. But beyond that, they are really kind of on their own, right? They're just as fucked over by a corporation as any other person would be in that position. So even though we might have to get a little more creative about how we manipulate that exec into being a desperate figure so as to give them some social challenge within the world, there can be plenty of people gunning for them. So within a life path of any character, execs included in this, we're looking for who has a vested interest in going after the players, who has, power over them, who might know things about them that would get them in trouble, even if those people themselves are not necessarily bad people, right? Sometimes loose lips sink ships, as the saying goes, and those loose lips can be very deadly in Night City. And then finally, we also have the idea of if you make the wrong enemy of a person in Night City, or, you know, and that can be something relatively innocent. We could be talking like you just don't help a person and they remember that, as the meme goes. You know, they will remember that. That matters because that will all define how is this person seen by the wider community. Are they seen as a benevolent savior? Are they seen as a horrible asshole? Are they seen as a terrorist? You know, there's more than a couple times my players have done things that are morally questionable. And even in Neon Inferno right now, they're gearing up some plans that are like highly objectionable by a lot of people who have, some of them made their voices very vocally known to these people. And so there's a lot to be said about legacy, right? When we talk about that, we might use Johnny Silverhand as an example. He is by and large remembered by the Night City of 2077 as a terrorist. He's not remembered for being the, you know, rocker boy he was in Samurai. He's not remembered as being a military vet that fought in the South Am Wars, which he was. He's not remembered for any of these things that may have had a positive influence on the people around him. He is remembered for being the guy who dropped a bomb on Arasaka Tower that created the modern hot zone in Night City. He is remembered as this person that brought a destructive end to the Fourth Corporate War. And I think that this should, more than anything else, kind of color the way we as GMs are built to handle death and legacy, moreover. So when we start talking with our players about the concept of their character dying, that conversation's hard. I know quite a few people that have played my games, other players that have been in games I've been a player in, that when that character finally dies, they have a moment where they have to seriously consider what just happened. You know, they have to think about how they feel. And sometimes they might be very angry, depending on the matter that killed them, right? depending on the events that culminated in their character's loss, they might be really bitter about it. I know one of the people I've played with in the past, they were incredibly upset that their character was presumed dead at the end of a gig. Even if they ended up later coming back and ended up not being dead at all, they had to make peace with their own mortality because, you know, that is a thing that can happen. But they had gotten themselves to a point they thought, I'm invincible. They were not invincible. So, you know, at the end of the day, that is the situation that we are contending with sometimes. So I think it's important to have that discussion really early on, as early as session 0, and maybe even throughout the game you're running as the campaign progresses, whenever it becomes appropriate to have that discussion. Because I truly think that when the time comes, the player should have in their mind what they want their character's life to represent in the wider context of the game. And this can be true even if that player is relatively new. So I want to talk about a story from the early days of Neon Inferno when we just had our first gig go really well. The players came out of that, everyone alive, still relatively healthy. No one got too close to death, and everyone was just ecstatic. They were like, yes, we did it. We pulled the heist off. We brought the thing home. It was jubilation. It was happiness. It was just this emphatic victory that they had come off of. And so the next gig, they get this job to go down and do an old secret Arasaka weapons facility and retrieve some blueprints from there that might help the local tech build them weapons and fabricate armaments for their community. So this goes pretty well for the most part, right up until they get sealed in this facility with a netrunner whose mind has been taken over by a rogue AI. So from this point on, things get really bad really fast. They go from 0 to 100. And so in the opening volleys of this culminating fight, Estrogen Light Rail, the rocker boy played by my good friend Maya, breaks ribs. So she can't move, not much. This is fine initially because the netrunners in the group at the time are up at the front of the room with her, right by an access point when she gets injured this way. So she resolves herself to being their bodyguard for the remainder of this mission. And so she is taking down drones left and right, and the netrunners are hacking through the network, trying to get down to those blueprints so they can extract them and get out of here. So they're fighting a netrunner. Maya, as Estrogen Light Rail, is fighting drones. And throughout this fight, Estrogen Light Rail's life is getting lower and lower and lower because these drones are constantly shooting her. She isn't able to dodge every bullet. She's not able to let her armor soak more than a couple of the shots. And so things begin to get fairly desperate when one of the netrunners is booted from the system and all of its security resets. The other half of the party had left them there quite a bit earlier, going deeper into the facility to find this netrunner as quick as they could. And so in this time between when they've left and this hack has failed, one of the two netrunners also leaves because they are frustrated now and they want this netrunner dead in real space. So the remaining netrunner continues trying to break the network with Estrogen Light Rail providing her cover fire. And it comes to a point where Estrogen Light Rail goes down. She has killed drone after drone after drone after drone. And she's now into her death saves. And when the group hears I succeeded my first one, they all get excited. Because to them, this means, oh, she'll be fine. In their minds, they're thinking she's going to be okay. This is fine. She'll live. Of course, that's not what happened. Otherwise, I wouldn't be including the story in a video about death. So, the following round, the remaining Netrunner there next to her takes shots at the drones. She does the same. They take down another couple drones here, and the drones finally stop pouring out into the room. And it's right then that she breathes her last. She says no words. She just says, yeah, I would not be expecting death here. And so I just breathe my last and move no longer. And from that point on, the Netrunner who sat there with her recognizes this just a few moments later. And as he looks up and notices this, he immediately falls to his knees and is racked with grief until the crew comes and finds him there. And they manage in this time, the next few rounds, to deal with the Netrunner, take him out, get the data, and then as they come back out into this entry area where the group had entered, they see Estrogen Light Rail there. And this, for context, is Maya's first real experience with death in a tabletop game. And I didn't know that at the time until we talked about it after. But this is also one of her first experiences with tabletop RPGs in general. So she had a little experience with D&D before she started playing Cyberpunk Red with us. But Cyberpunk Red was, at this time, a new game to her in a hobby that was relatively new conceptually to her as well. And so when we finally get to the point where we're wrapping the session, the crew has mourned her loss. There's an air of serious and solemn care for what comes next. Her belongings are divvied amongst the group, not necessarily for keeping, but for safeguarding until they can meet up with her girlfriend that she's expressed she has. And so when the cameras finally cut and we on Twitch go to our typical after game break so that we can break down what happened during the session, Maya is very quiet. And I say, okay, Maya, how are you doing? Because I know that that's not always easy. She says, honestly, I don't know how I feel right now. Because I really liked her. Because she was me. I said, yeah, that's usually where we start in Cyberpunk Red, is we make a character that feels like the best version of ourselves. And so I'm sorry that you're going through that. What did Estrogen Light Rail leave behind? And Maya's response to this was, well, she's got her girlfriend. And I said, well, her girlfriend is a brain dance technician, right? And Maya's like, yeah. And I said, and Estrogen Light Rail records all of her gigs and experiences so that if it might be a particularly salacious thing that she can turn into a bit of content later, she can have her girlfriend go through and do that. So yeah, she would have done that. Would her girlfriend have gotten a hold of the brain dance from her final moments? Maya wrote this thing out, and I'm not going to read it here because I'd have to go digging for it, but it made me cry. The first time I read it, it made me weep because it showed just how deeply Maya knew who her character was. She knew down to the minutest detail what and who Estrogen Light Rail was in the world. And so this, however, because of how the rest of the crew treated it, for which I'm incredibly proud of them, even now I am incredibly proud of the way that they chose to handle this very serious topic together. And I am completely lucky and privileged that the group that I play with is one that has that sense of empathy for each other and create a safe space for all of us to feel emotions together and to have that space to talk about those things. So as this is all unfolding at the end, Maya said, I really do feel, I felt at first very sad and uncertain as to what I wanted to do, but it's made me aware, based on how everyone else has treated this death, it's made me aware exactly how big an impact her death is going to have on the world. And now I'm excited because I get to define what that means. I get to determine what comes next because her girlfriend is probably the one who's going to join the crew with the all-consuming question of what could I have done or what actions could I have taken that would have prevented my girlfriend's death? What thing could I invent that will ensure no one, me or others, will have to ever lose someone in the way I've lost my girlfriend? And that is who she's played now through almost 20 episodes of the series as of the recording of this video. And so I'm incredibly proud of the way she handled it. And there's a lot of really bad ways to take death. And I think hers is probably the most productive that I've seen in a long time. So when we talk about how we as GMs can prepare our players to have that kind of a reaction to their character's death, I think the first and the most important aspect that we need to examine and really focus in on is asking our players as they're making their character, at this point, if your character had their way, what would they do as their last great act before they died? What legacy do they have or want to have? How will they be remembered by the people that they leave behind? What kind of a legacy do they want to create for themselves? And if your players start asking themselves these questions as part of the life path when they're building the character, now they not only are thinking about the glory that this person has in mind, the hubris they have in mind, but they also have a recognition of this character's attitude towards dying. Are they immortal? Are they bulletproof? Or are they understanding that tomorrow could be their last day and they're living each moment of that remaining time as if they'll never get another? And I think that that is probably the best way for us to have our players start to examine that, because when they come to that inevitable end of the road and they are sitting there on the ground, and what I do at my table when a player is dying, and I gave this opportunity to Maya in the story I gave you all, I ask them, what are your last words? What does Estrogen Light Rail have as her last words? Maya's choice was she wasn't expecting death. So she breathes in, breathes out, and that is the last. And others have told, find my brother, find my friend, give them this. They'll know what happened and they'll help. And so we begin to develop into this situation now where players are building a legacy, and they might build a backup character to fill that legacy when the time comes. Because I always think that that is another good practice to prepare your players for, is if this character dies, who will replace them? What is the backup you are creating? And to have them think about that second character, at least conceptually, if they don't fully roll them out, when they build their first one. Because when we've done that, we now have created it in their minds, again, a reason to have a backup ready to go. And they may not need that. You know, I have one player in Neon Inferno who, after 19 episodes, they're still kicking. They're still alive, but they've cheated death a few times. They've been on the edge, and they might not survive to the end. All that, at the end of the day, is to say that they have backups. They've had backups since day one, but they've been lucky to not need them. So with that in mind, the last topic of death I want to discuss is how to prepare your players to mourn a character. Now, I have been, I suppose you could say, fortunate or unfortunate enough to never have lost one of my own characters when I played in Cyberpunk. But I know what it feels like to be one of the other players in the room when someone dies. And I mentioned before that I was incredibly proud of my crew that I GM for with how they handled Estrogen Light Rail's death, because how they handled it is by and large how I as a player would have handled it, which is you acknowledge the relationship your two characters had. Maybe you didn't know them very well. And even though that they were brother or sister in arms, they are not someone that, you know, you really knew well enough to be sad about. And that's okay. But if they were someone close, like was the case when I lost my most recent friend, I know I've talked about it before on these episodes. When I lost Isaac, my Netrunner friend, played by one of my other friends who was in the game that I was in, my character Virgil had a very hard time coming to grips with that happening. And as the gig was wrapping up, there was all kinds of things that happened. And I really wish we had recorded it, because honestly, it was probably one of the most impactful moments in a tabletop game that I've ever been in. And so the way that that played out, I won't really rehash here, because you can watch it elsewhere. I'll try to link a card up above to take you to where I talk about it in another video. But I think that it bears mentioning that when we finally cleared the scene where he died, and we report into the person who gave us our mission and tell them, well, we figured out who killed your daughter, they won't bother anyone ever again. And we were thanked by this person saying, well, I feel like I'm going to sleep a whole lot better tonight than I have for months. And Virgil's response to that was, well, I'm glad at least someone will. And she just looks back at me and says, I'm so sorry for your loss. He seemed like a good kid. Virgil, after having a couple drinks at the bar here before leaving, goes home and finds the array of different street drugs that he stashed over his many adventures. And after looking at them, he thinks how easy it would be to take a little too much of the right, or I suppose wrong, substance, depending on how you look at it. And that once he did that, there would be no more pain. He wouldn't have to consider the outcome of anything beyond tonight. It would send him screaming over the edge. And then there would be silence. But in that moment, he remembers what Isaac said to his brother moments before he would unfortunately die. And he remembers hearing the words, "This is not the way." And so instead of doing the thing that his inner demons are demanding of him, he goes to his bed, pulls out his agent, turns on some music from the garden, and tries to find sleep, knowing that in his heart, he will still have grief in the morning. And I think being able to verbalize that kind of a sentiment, and then as the GM, if you follow it up with the NPCs who recognized that character and valued them, you have a funeral. You gather everyone that was important, you have discussion about what comes next, and you take a moment to honor that character's life, just like we would for a real person. And that might sound ridiculous. That might sound outrageous to some people. Why would we mourn a fictional character? They're just numbers on a paper. They're like maybe a fancy bit of artwork. They're the culmination of a couple of dice rolls at the start of a day. But I promise you, at your table, when that character has died, your player is the person on the other end of that, and their friends who were next to them when it happened when they all feel and think the end of that session, they're going to be feeling loss. They're going to be thinking about that character's death, and they're going to be mourning it almost as if they were a real living, breathing person. And so we as GMs need to be open and understanding of that fact when this happens. And we need to know that it's not a matter of if it's going to happen, but a matter of when. So I hope that this week's episode was helpful for you all. As always, feel free to discuss down in the comments here on YouTube, as well as in the appropriate channels on my Discord server, which is linked below. If you have any stories that you'd like to share around the concept of death at your table with me or my fellow players, or if you would like to ask any questions, as always, I'm more than happy to be a resource for you all and to discuss this with you further. So that's going to be it for me this week. I hope you have a wonderful morning, evening, or afternoon, wherever you are in the world. I hope you stay healthy, stay safe. Until next we speak, peace.